This is the Antidisestablishmentarian podcast, episode 9. Today is May 12th, 2025. I'm going to continue to not use any type of special effects, microphones, backgrounds, and just kind of give it to you straight for now. I did add a little intro in the beginning, but that's it for now. So, a lot has happened over the last 48, 72 hours, and I'm going to focus first on the developments in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, again, a lot has transpired. The first thing that transpired was that the EU leaders, the collision of the willing. Now, for those of you who don't know, the collision of the willing is a bunch of countries, mostly Western, who are basically banding together. Some of them might contribute troops to what's known as a reassurance force. The reassurance force, once there is a ceasefire peace deal signed between Russia and Ukraine, would presumably be a force that is inside Ukraine, not on the front lines, but somewhere in Ukraine to reduce the likelihood of Russia launching another invasion, which I do believe is likely unless steps are taken to minimize that risk. And so the leaders of France, Germany, and also Poland, as well as there was one more person that I'm forgetting, France, Germany, and Britain, as well as, like I said, Poland and the Ukrainian President Zelensky. They met in Kiev, actually. They met in Kiev, I believe this was May 10th or so, maybe May 9th, May 10th. And they basically said, look, ceasefire starting on Monday, 30-day ceasefire starting on Monday, or if Russia doesn't agree, there's going to be sanctions and we're going to up the military aid. Now, the big news was that the US signed on to this 30-day ceasefire demand, essentially, from the EU and Kiev, and basically said, yeah, which suggests that Trump is starting to get tired of Putin, to quote Trump, tapping him along, and they sent that over. Now, on Saturday, so this must have happened on Friday, but on Saturday, Putin decides to go live with a press conference. Now, the press conference was scheduled at a very odd time. It was supposed to start at midnight. It actually started at 1:30 a.m. Moscow time, and it was about 30 minutes long. I listened to it live, and basically, Putin started off by saying how Ukraine doesn't abide by any ceasefires. They struck our quote unquote energy infrastructure during the energy infrastructure ceasefire, and they refused to do a ceasefire during the May 9th celebration from, what was it, May 8th to May 10th or something like that. And so he didn't say no explicitly, but basically he said, let's continue the negotiations in Turkey that were left off back in on May 15th, 2022. So this was about 3 months into the war. And that was his counter proposal, if you might call it that. Now, some people, and including Trump, to be fair, were like, that's a great idea. He wants to negotiate. But before we get too far, we need to understand what the Istanbul negotiations were in 2022. There's been a lot of misconceptions. There's been a lot of conspiracy theories about it. But this was when Ukraine was on its back foot. And essentially, Ukraine, during the darkest days that led up and during those negotiations, were, Russia was demanding essentially what it's demanding now. But back then, they actually specified, and they almost even got Ukraine to agree to the following. The first, and I think the worst, is Ukrainian quote-unquote demilitarization. Ukraine was supposed to limit its army size to 85,000 active personnel. To put that into perspective, there's about 1 million now serving in the Ukrainian army. Now, again, it is a war, but 85,000 active personnel, it's a joke. I don't even think you can cover the entire border with Russia. And so that was the first. There was also a limitation on the number of tanks, the number of artillery pieces. This was before drone warfare, so there was no limitations on drone warfare. There was a ban that the Ukrainians were supposed to actually write into their constitution about not being able to accept any Western aid, any Western weapons. So no weapons, no military advisors, 85,000 troop limit, a few hundred tanks, and a few hundred artillery pieces. That was the demilitarization part. Of course, there was also other parts like Ukraine writing into their constitution that they won't join NATO, and a few other pieces. And rightfully, Ukraine, when it realized that it had a chance to defend itself, refused and walked away. And that is true. Zelensky basically said, we're not signing this. This was when Western aid started to come in. And all of a sudden, the Ukrainians were putting up a lot of resistance. And it didn't seem like Putin could conquer all of Ukraine all that easily. So Zelensky made a very bold decision. He basically said, no, thank you, and he walked away. So those are the negotiations that Putin wants to come back to. And he ironically, or coincidentally, I should say, said that we should restart them on May 15th, the day 3 years ago that the Ukrainians walked away from those negotiations. Now, I'll get into why he said this, what's in it for him. But of course, the most obvious part of it all is that he wants to use the Istanbul 2022 framework of negotiations, where again, Ukraine is basically left practically without a means to defend itself if Russia attacks again. And he wants that used as a basis for a ceasefire or a peace deal. And so it becomes very obvious that Putin isn't scared that Ukraine is going to attack big Russia with more nuclear weapons than I believe the rest of the world combined. But definitely it has the most nuclear weapons. I mean, it's got thousands. It's because he wants to have the option of invading again. And he realizes that he is on the verge of losing Ukraine. And so for a while, I thought he would actually come around to signing the ceasefire. And you may have heard some of my earlier episodes. I still think there's a chance, but it seems like he's playing the long game. And what I mean by that is that Putin, he calls himself a student of history, and so he's read up on history, as Tucker Carlson has so disgracefully shown us. And we had got to listen to the Russian skewed version of history from Rurik in the 1990s or something like that. Not 1990s, 990 AD is where he's claiming Russia started, in Kiev of all places. 900 something. And so ultimately, what he's realizing is this is it, at least the way things are going. If the EU is allowed to send a reassurance force and the Ukrainians are continued to be supplied with Western weapons, he may not get another crack at Ukraine. And so what he's trying to do is basically get not so much the Crimean recognition that Trump offhandedly offered him, it seems, not even a ban on NATO, which NATO was never a serious consideration. 20% of Ukrainian territory is occupied. How is it possibly ever going to join NATO, especially with the likes of Hungary and Turkey and a few other countries that are adamantly opposed to it, Slovakia? So that was, okay, I never really considered that to be all that big of a concession, although I guess symbolically they could have at least used it to negotiate. But he realizes that, again, you have to think of this from the perspective of Putin, a Russian imperialist. And you have to think of it almost as Texas seceding. And so, in the American eyes, if Texas ever seceded, many Americans would probably do anything it takes to bring Texas back because they will consider that to be American territory, notwithstanding if the Texans themselves were adamantly opposed to being a part of the United States and have just fought a bloody, bloody war for their independence. But of course, it's even worse than that. I mean, the parallels to Texas aren't even close to what's going on in Ukraine because Russia, of all countries, was the one that actually voted to dissolve the Soviet Union. And so now they're trying to get back the territories that they voted to become independent from. None of it makes sense. None of it makes sense. But in any case, Putin does believe that Ukraine, specifically central and eastern Ukraine, starting with Kiev, but then also Kharkiv and Odessa and a lot of these other bigger cities, he believes they are historically Russian cities. And so he realizes that if he allows Ukraine to go west with reassurance forces, Western weaponry, this might be the end of his imperial ambitions. He'll be left with a land bridge to Crimea, and that's it. And I don't think he cares about the domestic view of it because I think he understands he can spin it, even though, yes, if there's a ceasefire right now, he'll have to explain how he lost 1 million men in terms of casualties and got a land bridge to Crimea, but no regional capital since the start of the full-scale invasion. I mean, not a single regional capital was captured. He captured Kherson, but then he lost it. He retreated because he couldn't hold it. And so that brings us back to why he's insisting on Ukraine being demilitarized. The other part of it is he is insisting on, in part, on the four provinces that he has annexed in September. Now, if you remember the timeline, here's what happened. This is again 2022. Russia starts the invasion on February 24th, 2022, and it's basically a blitzkrieg. And it goes quickly. They're on the verge of, it seems like, taking a number of big cities, Kiev, Chernihiv. There's also Kharkiv. They might even threaten Odessa. They took Kherson. They're threatening Mykolaiv. And so it seems like they are out to get a huge chunk of Ukraine, if not all of it. Then the Ukrainians start putting up fierce resistance. The Russians realize they can't take Kiev, not without a draft. And so they basically go ahead and say, aha, just kidding. We never really wanted Kiev. They switched, and this is after the Ukrainians walked away from negotiations. They basically said, okay, we're leaving Kiev, we're leaving northern Ukraine, we're leaving southern Ukraine to an extent. We're going to focus on the Donbass. And that's what they did starting in the summer of 2022. But then their little offensive started to kind of sizzle out. And the Ukrainians, one of the things about this war is the Russians consistently underestimated the Ukrainians, I would say up until now. They've stopped, I think, but they have for a good period of time. And so they basically left a minuscule skeleton force in Kharkiv. And the Ukrainians, realizing it, overran those positions. They took huge chunks of Kharkiv. And that's when Putin started panicking because that was a route. It was arguably the only route in the war where there was a huge and quick succession of territory being gained by one party or the other. And so then, after that happened, Putin does what? He calls for a mobilization. Not for a full-scale mobilization, but he does get about 300,000. He calls up about 300,000 reservists, which, by the way, he breaks a promise to do so because that's why he was so hesitant. If you're wondering why didn't he do it earlier, at the start of the quote unquote special operation, he said he's not going to call up any reservists, only volunteers. And then he called up 300,000 reservists, by the way, that are now being called a endangered species in Russia. There's about 85,000 of them left. The rest either died or are injured. And so right now there's a controversy where apparently they've been trying to convince them to sign volunteer contracts for a variety of different reasons. I'm not exactly sure that all the reasons are publicly being stated because there are some downsides and upsides to trying to force them to sign contracts. One of the downsides is that they're going to have to pay out bonuses, presumably, and up their pay. The current called up reservists from 2022, they've been there for now, what, 2.5 years? And so I guess their families and them are rightfully complaining that they need to be demobilized. They have been there for far longer than they expected, and so they're forcing them to sign contracts because they're figuring, well, at least under contract, then you're signing a new term that you'll serve under, even if it means paying them out. But naturally, they would prefer not to. So there's been a lot of back and forth. They've been forcing them, including the injured ones, onto these onslaughts where they're taking huge casualties, and that's one way they're trying to force them to basically switch to a contract basis. But again, that's neither here nor there. After he mobilizes 300,000 reservists, he basically is able to stop the Ukrainian advance. He still retreats from Kherson because he realizes he can't hold it over the river. The supply chains were getting absolutely wrecked by the HIMARS strikes. And so ultimately, and quite frankly, after November 2022, 2.5 years ago or so, the lines have barely changed. The lines have barely changed. And so that's basically what happened. And now he's basically saying, look, one of the things he did in September of 2022, I believe, was he basically went ahead and to kind of rally support around the country, he officially annexed 4 of the regions that he held, or at least in part held: Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Luhansk, none of which he holds 100%. Luhansk he holds most of, but not even that is he holding 100% of. So, because he did that, now, today, he's insisting on those regions, but he doesn't control them all. And I am skeptical that he actually realistically expects to get them. Because Kherson is located on the other side of the river, and he must know that he's not going to get that at the very least. Plus, Zaporozhye has a huge city, also half of which is on one side and half of which is on the other side of the river. He is not going to be able to take that city. So again, that really, the only militarily realistic scenario is him taking the Donbass, which, to be fair, he said was the mission after his failed Kiev offensive. And now he is basically, but even that, he's got a couple of fairly sizable cities to take. Keep in mind, he hasn't taken in over a year a major settlement. Avdiivka, when the U.S. cut off aid for about 6 months, was the last one that he took, and that was under the Biden administration. And finally, after 6 months, they passed more aid, and then I'm sure that's helped a great deal. But he hasn't taken a huge or even a medium-sized settlement since that time. And we're talking, Avdiivka was like 50,000 people. I'm not sure exactly, but right around there, maybe a little more, a little less. And he's got still Kramatorsk, he's got Slavyansk, he's got Konstantinovka, he's got Pokrovsk. I mean, it's going to take him years at this rate to take even the Donbass. And with 1 million casualties, he's now accrued 1 million casualties. It's about 250,000 dead, and then also about 750,000 injured. Granted, some of the injured do come back on the battlefield, but nonetheless, he's very close to being up to 1 million casualties. It might take him another million casualties just to take Donbass. So what's the play here? What is the play? I think Putin understands that he's not going to get all four regions. And he also probably doesn't want to take the rest of Donbass, not at that cost. He's probably using it as a negotiating chip because he figures, you know what, I'll ask for everything and I'll get maybe more of it than I would otherwise. But again, that's one part of it. He's also asking for Ukrainian demilitarization. So, two very distinct goals here. Short term is get as much of those regions as possible to show, I guess, to the people in Russia that, look, I told you the mission was to get Donbass and we got most of it, if not all of it. And then the long term is that's him. That's not the Russian public doesn't really care about what happens to Ukraine. The Russian public, in large part, is apathetic. They don't want to have anything to do with the war. If you call them up, they will not tell you, most of them, whether they support or don't support the war, out of sight, out of mind, as much as possible. So he believes he can't be the leader of Russia who lets Ukraine go irrecoverably west. And so on one hand, short term, he wants as much as he can get. Recognition of Crimea, he'll take it from Trump. An official NATO ban, he'll take it from Trump. As much of the four regions that he's occupying, he'll take that. But in the long term, he's thinking, I can't let Ukraine go west. And so I need to always, and the next guy after me, always should have the option to come back in. Belarus now is almost a part of Russia. So that means Ukraine in the foreseeable future might very well be surrounded by three sides if we continue to look at the Black Sea as, you know, in the sense that Crimea is in the south. It might be surrounded by three sides, if not four sides, if we can consider Transnistria, by Russia. Now, again, there's always going to be a part, the western part, that's not going to be touching anything occupied by Russia. And so Ukraine is not in serious danger of being surrounded, but he wants to come back in, and he probably wants to recreate his imperial ambition of Novorossiya, New Russia, which is supposed to be basically from Kharkiv to Odessa. Plus, he'll take Kiev, the birthplace of what he believes Russia is. And so I do think he regrets leaving Kiev and Chernihiv. He just didn't think things would get as bad as him calling up the reservists. If he thought he would have to call up the reservists, he probably would have done it sooner and never left. In any case, that's where we are right now. Now, what's his play? Because the next thing that happened, after he basically said, I want to continue the negotiations from 2022, where I'm asking for everything. And starting on May 15th, Zelensky did something which I thought initially was hasty, but ultimately, it actually was, I believe now, looking how things are coming together, a pretty smart move. He basically called him out. He didn't say that negotiations on May 15th are going to be contingent on him accepting a ceasefire. But Zelensky did say, I'll see you in Turkey on Thursday. I'll see you in Turkey on Thursday personally, and I don't want to hear any excuses like you always give. And that put, I think, Putin into a bit of a bind. Because I think what his plan was to restart the negotiations, drag him out, and hope, and I think this is what he's going for, that Trump will just get tired of it and walk away as he's threatened to do, but walk away, not just from negotiations, but from supporting Ukraine. And if he walks away from supporting Ukraine, well then, all of a sudden, Putin believes he can take Ukraine. Sooner or later, he's going to have the advantage. He's got more manpower. He's got more resources. The Europeans, he believes, are too divided and too weak to stop Russia and help Ukraine. And so, as a result, he believes with the U.S. out of the picture, this is his golden opportunity. And he'll either take it or he'll get Ukraine to agree to the 2022 Istanbul um, concessions that he was demanding, and which, as many have noted, are equivalent to a capitulation. So, in other words, he is either going to take Ukraine most of it by force, or he'll force Ukraine to basically become vulnerable to a third invasion. It's sad that we have to talk in these terms nowadays. Invasions seems like something right out of history books, but here we are. So Zelensky did, like I said, a smart move by calling Putin's bluff, and not surprisingly, the Kremlin today responded and basically said, no, 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 Putin is not going to show up on Thursday, even though in his midnight press conference, that's exactly what he was basically saying. They said, no, the diplomats have to lay the groundwork before, anything serious happens. That always takes time. And so basically now, I think Zelensky did the right thing. I do think that JD Vance and Trump will continue to pressure Zelensky to start the negotiations in Turkey. But I think now they are more clear-eyed about the fact that this is probably a scheme to drag out the negotiations as much as possible. And there's a good chance he's not serious in any type of realistic settlement. So the sanctions are supposed to kick in today. I believe they are kicking in now. In Europe, it is what, +6, +7 hours. So it is past midnight. I expect the sanctions to kick in. We'll see if the U.S. follows suit. Right now, the U.S. has been very reluctant to sanction Russia, the Trump administration, but we'll see if they actually follow suit. That will be interesting, because if they do, that means they agree with the Europeans and Kiev that Putin is not serious, and they need to basically have some consequences for him not being serious about negotiations. On the other hand, if they hold off on sanctions, then they're going to basically believe that there is a chance, a realistic chance, that Putin does want to negotiate a settlement in Turkey, and so they might hold off. I suspect they'll hold off, to be honest with you, because they seem to side and give Putin the benefit of the doubt far too often. Less so nowadays, more than before, but still, they tend to give him the benefit of the doubt. Now, what does Zelensky do? This is, I think, critical. Yes, in my opinion, I don't think he's got much of a choice. He probably should send teams to Turkey to start negotiating. I think the Trump administration will want that, and I think Zelensky is going to be in a tight spot. With that being said, I hope Zelensky is making some deals with the Trump administration. Specifically, with very little military aid forthcoming nowadays from the United States, I think Zelensky and Ukraine are less beholden to the U.S. than they were before. There's still a lot that the U.S. is doing for Ukraine, military intelligence, other things like that, but less so than before. And so maybe Zelensky can say, look, you think he's interested in a serious negotiations? Fine, we'll show up. But if he continues making these maximalist demands, well then, let's agree that you'll provide us with weapons, because he's not serious then. So let's say, for example, negotiations go nowhere within a month, send us some military weapons, a sizable chunk. And this way he'll have an incentive to conclude those negotiations before more arms arrive. Is that going to change the calculus? I don't know. I think Putin's going to have to wait and find out how much weaponry the United States is willing to send, how serious the Europeans are, how serious the sanctions are. But that's the way I would probably play it. Zelensky could also do something else, but I think it's a little more risky. Zelensky could say, we don't agree with laying the groundwork for negotiations in Istanbul because Russia is going to drag it out. If they were serious, they would accept a 30-day ceasefire. And then we can go ahead and meet and discuss. And I think there's a very good chance that Zelensky will say that. But I think the risk is that Russia basically says, no ceasefire. We start negotiations first. And the Trump administration will think, better negotiations than no negotiations, and they ain't gonna agree to a ceasefire. In which case, there's a potential for another spat between Kiev and Washington, and then Putin might be getting what he wants, with the United States walking away both from negotiations and from supporting Ukraine. So I would probably slow roll this if I was Zelensky and minimize the risk. But again, been very he's been very right about a lot of things, and so I will give him the benefit of the doubt as well. And so that's what's transpired over the last 72 hours. We'll find out if there's going to be any more developments, but I do think this is a critical week. We'll find out if those Istanbul negotiations will start happening or not, and how maximalist the Russian demands are, and how serious they are about actually signing or agreeing to a ceasefire. The one thing I will say, as I've said before, is, at least for now, almost regardless of what ceasefire is signed, I do believe this is a colossal loss for Putin, which is why he's so hesitant, I think, about negotiations, even though, in my opinion, in the near future, it doesn't seem like his situation improves dramatically. I think he is grasping. And so I think that the Winter War is a good example of how this is a colossal failure for Russia. During the Winter War, the USSR, as I may have mentioned in earlier episodes, attacked Finland. It was supposed to be an easy war. They had huge casualties within just a few months. I mean, we're talking about over 100,000 dead, mostly from frostbite and stuff like that, but nonetheless, huge casualties. And the Finns fought bravely. There was weapon support. Granted, it was from a country that nowadays is frowned upon, but nonetheless, there were weapons coming into Finland, and Nazi Germany was helping Finland, but can't blame the Finns for accepting the weapons. This was before the invasion of Poland, I believe, anyway, so things to keep in mind. But nonetheless, they were accepting aid, not just from Nazi Germany, but from other places as well, and fighting the Soviet army bravely, and they were able to withstand. Sooner or later, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, I believe this was actually the Molotov Pact, Ribbentrop Pact, where they basically then, Germany didn't want to upset the Soviets, so they actually stopped the aid to the Finns. The Finns were on their back foot. The Soviets were able to learn from their mistakes. They're slow learners, but they do learn. They got a new general, I believe. They changed their tactics, and they started actually taking some land, but at, again, a very high cost. And so ultimately, the Finns were forced to agree to a ceasefire. They lost about 11% of their land, which is incidentally almost the exact percent that the Ukraine has lost since the full-scale invasion in February 2022. But looking back, and actually officially ceded that land, something that Ukraine is unwilling to do. But looking back, nobody really would argue that Finland lost that war. Technically, they might have lost because they ceded territory, including a city, Vyborg, that was considered to be a pretty significant city in Finland, although they got a lot of the machinery out, from what I understand, before the Soviets took over. So it wasn't as critical. But nonetheless, most Finns considered the Winter War to be a very valiant, noble, independence type of war that they won by staying alive and keeping their independence. So this idea that Russia won, I think, this sounds, I mean, if this is what winning looks like, if having 1 million casualties and no regional centers to show for it is what winning looks like. 3 years, the line has barely changed in years now, the contact line. If that is what winning looks like, I don't know. I would hate to see what losing looks like for Russia. Nonetheless, we are where we are. Let's find out what happens. Let's hope Zelensky, to use the cliche, plays his cards right. Apparently he has some cards after all. And let's see what happens. I hope that Trump doesn't fall for Putin's thinly veiled attempts to try to drag this out and isolate Ukraine. And yeah, like I said, let's hope for the best.